The last video looked at the Enlightenment as an intellectual phenomenon and the strands of philosophy it produced. This second part focuses on the changes these ideas brought about in society and the political regimes of the time. Whereas before we touched on the origins of the Enlightenment mindset, now we will examine the 18th century on its own terms. Although I said that the renewed commitment to democracy was a legacy of this period, during the 1700s, enlightened despots were in vogue, who tried to implement rational policies on an ignorant population from above. Europe, though, was divided into wildly different political regimes at this time, from the constitutional monarchy of Great Britain to the swollen grandeur of centralizing French kings and the anarchic and archaic Holy Roman Empire. It was those at the peripheries, Prussia, Scandinavia, Spain and Russia, who were attracted to new forms of government that they could use to propel themselves to great power status, and pursued them with varying degrees of success. Most people living in 18th century Europe, certainly the upper and middle classes, would have thought that life was changing for the better, and that they were living through an era of progress. Luxuries from the New World, such as sugar, tobacco, coffee and chocolate, were becoming more affordable. These pleasures were, of course, enabled by the slave trade. Uprooted Africans were forced to suffer for Europe's comfort. There was an intellectual environment conducive to new and original thinking that was markedly different from the 17th century, where philosophers were considered ungodly and held in great contempt. People began to imagine that the world was more than 6,000 years old, as could be deduced from the Bible, but they could not yet prove it. God, in the most part, survived science, but he was no longer viewed as a judgmental Jehovah, but a beneficent force, unlimited by scripture and codifier of natural laws. In essence, predictable. These natural laws were not limited to Newtonian physics, though. They carried over into what anthropologist David Graeber calls the Newtonian economics of Adam Smith, whose invisible hand is often understood as an allegory for providence, working to ensure that scarcities are replenished and surpluses distributed of their own accord, without government intervention. Consequently, views on the role of religion in society began to shift towards considering the church as working in tandem with the state to turn people into better citizens. Rousseau, for example, thought that religion should only seek to develop the rights of man as an individual. Contemporary cultural works, such as Lessing's Nathan the Wise, saw an essential commonality between the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity and Islam, and advocated religious toleration. This was accompanied by a great intolerance against the ignorant and prejudiced, which often took on a class dimension, contempt for the uneducated masses, who were quite obviously so, since they had no state schools to attend, and mostly little desire to learn more than was necessary for their traditions and way of life. The enlightened absolutist rulers of the 18th century had a lot in common. They all wanted to concentrate power in their hands, expand their militaries, increase tax revenue, and last but not least, improve the lives of their subjects so that they would become more productive. Essentially, this was state feudalism. Imagine the Nordic model of today applied to the monarchies of the 1700s. Rulers wanted to create a coherent bureaucracy of competent civil servants, promoted by merit instead of noble blood, in place of a bloated, archaic, and often exceedingly complicated feudal system of obligations and privileges. They also had humanitarian goals and, on the whole, made efforts to reduce overt cruelty in their regimes by banning practices such as judicial torture and cruel execution methods such as death by drowning or burning at the stake. Property crimes, however, were generally punished more harshly through deportation or forced labour. In place of feudal guilds, which saw to the interests of particular sectors of the economy, they promoted nation-state protectionism against international competition. They introduced state schools for primary and technical education and tolerated religious minorities, including Jews. At the beginning of his reign, Frederick the Great described Brandenburg Prussia as being like a hermaphrodite, in that it was neither a minor nor a major state, yet somewhere in between. Frederick's was an unhappy adolescence, After 7 years in his mother's care, he was transferred to the guardianship of his father, Frederick William. After years of physical and psychological abuse by his father, Frederick the Great inherited Prussia at the age of 28 and immediately set about trying to make a name for himself on the world stage. The main action he took to ensure his fame was the unprovoked invasion of Silesia, a region in modern-day Poland, but spilling over into eastern Germany and the northern Czech Republic, which was then a possession of the Habsburg monarchy, whose court was held at Vienna. In his mature reign, Frederick closed the gap between his territories in Brandenburg and East Prussia by partitioning Poland. Frederick was held in contempt by the literary lights of Goethe and Schiller, who valued the particularism of the Holy Roman Empire against his centralizing militarism. 19th century nationalists held him up as a precursor of the unified German state, even though half his territory was in Western Russia and Poland. Frederick's most famous admirer is Adolf Hitler, who had a portrait of the Prussian king hung up in his bunker in 1945. Russia, during the early reign of Catherine the Great, was overwhelmingly rural, and of that countryside population, half of the peasants were serfs, which means that they were farm labourers bound to the land and noble overlords. She did not overturn serfdom, but strengthened Russia's institutions and opened state schools. Catherine was German and became Tsarina through marriage. Towards the last years of her rule, she turned against Enlightenment ideas when they began to criticize absolutism in Russia, and she persecuted Jacobins fiercely after the execution of Louis XVI and his family. Unlike Frederick, she had a poor posthumous reputation as a libertine and murderess of her husband.